Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, Introvert Myth of the Week. Extroverts are better salespeople. Leadership Tip of the Week. Activity is only a proxy for engagement. And a discussion with Denise Willier. Denise helps female founders turn their business into a force for good through her bespoke consultancy, training and coaching. She's been featured on the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and in The Guardian. And as a former CEO, she's well placed to offer this help. Just before speaking to Denise, this show comes out in the first week of Series 2 of Activate Your Introvert. I would like to ask for your help. 2 things. Number 1, give me a question. What's your question about introversion, leadership and performance? In each episode, I answer one question and invite the owner of the question onto the show. To ask your question, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box near the top of the page. You can choose if you want to ask it live or not. Number 2, I'm about to ask you to press pause. If you're enjoying understanding more about introversion and leadership from the show, I'd like you to help others benefit too. You can help by pausing this recording, going to your iTunes and giving this show a review, hopefully 5 stars. Our algorithmic world means more people will then see the show and hopefully listen to it, especially if you do it this week. As for 2 weeks commencing 21st of June, I'm giving away a copy of my book, Running Meetings That Make Things Happen, every day to 1 reviewer. Thank you. One of the stories, believable or not, in the news this week is how our Prime Minister likes to tell rambling stories and jokes in cabinet meetings, which often distracted from the main purpose of the meeting. It's not for me to comment on why Boris Johnson might, if he even did, act in this way. However, I've seen it in many other meetings run by other people. It's normally been by somebody who doesn't really like the detail of the meeting, does like the sound of their own voice, and believes they're very clever. I've also chatted to leaders and those running meetings who do it to generate activity in the meeting. Activity is only a proxy for engagement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I've been in many training sessions and sat through many keynote presentations where the speaker has told everybody to stand up, do some activity and then sit down. Why? So they increase engagement, they say, but they're actually getting activity, not engagement. Tell people to do things, some will love it. Most will do it but not engage with it, and some will do it or not do it while actively disengaging. 2 examples. A presentation where I was told in the first few minutes to stand up, wave my arms in the air and shout. I was surprised when I looked around how many other people were not joining in either. I asked several of those who did the activity about what they felt whilst doing it, and they weren't happy about it, and they listened slightly less to the presentation afterwards. At a meeting a couple of years ago, the facilitator told the group they needed energizing. Great to be told you need energizing, huh? Firstly, they were told to do star jumps, and I was in the room. Needless to say, I didn't. Then they told us about how excited we should all feel about this meeting. I hate being told how to feel. What about you? Interviewing introverts has made me realise that most introverts don't like being told how to feel or to display those feelings. This does, of course, also apply to some extroverts, but being told to show your feelings is more likely to annoy introverts. It's another example of creating activity when what's really wanted is engagement. Engagement happens in the mind. If you want people to engage in your meeting, your content has to be interesting and they have to feel psychologically safe to say what they're thinking about it. That's engagement. If you want some more ideas, my book, Running Meetings That Make Things Happen, will help. This show is all about understanding introversion and building business. What would you like to know about introversion in business? Thomas Spears, thank you for asking, are introverts more negative than extroverts? Firstly, I want to cover a related question about happiness or unhappiness, in case that's what Thomas is really asking about. Introverts may often appear less demonstratively happy than extroverts. It doesn't mean they are less happy. It means they demonstrate their emotions less. Are they more negative? Introverts tend to be more introspective than extroverts. That might mean they tend to see flaws, often their own. Maybe they overdo the introspection. Perhaps that's a separate issue. If more negative means, are they more likely to moan about things in meetings at the infamous water cooler? I haven't seen it. I know plenty of people who like to moan about the issues of the world, why they're doing it, and actually they're doing it in an extroverted way, while the introverts keep quiet. What question would you like answered about introversion? Whether you want to ask the question on air, be named like Thomas or not, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also join the Facebook group Activate Your Introvert to discuss the answers. Now it's time to chat to Denise. Welcome, Denise.
Hi there, John. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really good to arrange this chat, and I've been so looking forward to it. And while we were talking about it off air, it was like, oh, yes, just got to get around to pressing the record button. I'm really looking forward to talking about the advice for women founders of business, and in a way, exploring some of the parallels between that and some of the advice that introverts and extroverts get or should be given differently. Before we dive into that, are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I am an introvert, which I think often surprises people because they think there's a kind of misperception that CEOs are generally extroverted people, when in fact, I think the research that's been done shows that a high percentage of CEOs, and some very successful ones at that, are in fact introverted.
I think that's a really good point, because there is a myth that goes around, and I often speak about it. Several myths that go around, but one of them is that introverts can't be good leaders, and I think introverts can be extremely good leaders. So I'm glad that somebody agrees with me at least. Denise, what got you started into kind of leaving the CEO world, if I can put it like that, and moving to helping female founders?
Basically, I'd got to a point in my CEO job where I was either going to go for another role, because you can't be a CEO and sort of like step down into a different role, not least because you've lost your subject matter expertise. So it was really a question of, do I want to set up my own business, or do I want to go for another CEO role? And the more I thought about it, the more I decided that I wanted to put all of that sort of time and energy into creating something for myself, and not another sort of like 3, 4, possibly even 5 years in a CEO role.
Okay.
So that's what kind of prompted the big jump. And actually, probably it links a little bit to your podcast. Is I when I was researching, I went off and did what I always do, which is go get a load of books to kind of read up and think through things. And I really, outside of the kind of typical how to start a business type book, I really struggled with finding stories about female founders in particular. And the books that I did find were all kind of very extroverted, kind of daring do, buccaneering type style. So, your typical Apprentice and Dragon's Den type things. And it was I found it quite off-putting.
I cringe at the thought of that program. You decided to set up a consultancy to help female founders drive their business forwards, I guess.
Yeah.
I get why you decided to focus on females, but what's actually different? Couldn't you do exactly the same for men and women, or is there something different?
In the last couple of years, there's been a big review done by Alison Rose, who's now the CEO of NatWest, and she looked into the state of female entrepreneurship in the United Kingdom and found that there were obstacles at every stage of the entrepreneurial journey, from startup right through to scale up, for female founders that male-led businesses didn't experience. She found that once those female founders had established their business into a scale up, then the obstacles weren't so problematic. But it was every stage from scale up. There were just from startup, there were just so many obstacles. So some of that was to do with being more cash strapped, finding it harder to get investment. A lot of it to do with taking the burden of family and caring responsibilities, but also a lot to do with confidence as well, and women's lack of confidence in and it's a kind of the analogy I would use is quite often in recruitment, what will happen is when a woman goes for a job, she wants to be absolutely confident that she can meet 100% of the criteria. Whereas when a man goes for a job, he'll go for a job when he can meet, say, 60% or so of the criteria, and go for the job and give it a go, which is fair enough, because you're going to a job that's a stretch for you, so you don't expect to be 100%. But typically, women want to have all the boxes ticked before they'll make that jump.
Interesting. And I guess I've had a similar discussion about introverts as well. So I guess being an introverted woman that's going for a job would be even more so. You want 110% of the boxes ticked. Do you think that women get different business advice, or should they get different business advice?
In my experience, from what I've seen of the kind of advisory consulting world, and I've had a very, very good look at it, there is caliber of advice that I see women being given isn't very good. So it's partly because there's a lot of advice around mindset that men wouldn't be given that kind of advice. So this kind of like, are you getting in your own way? And, how are you disempowering yourself? And kind of actually questions that, when you think about them, are quite undermining of people's confidence. And you would just never, ever see those kind of comments being made to male-led businesses.
Imagine sometimes maybe we should, but
and then so I see a lot of sort of like sowing the seeds of doubt in people's minds about their abilities, and then a lot of the advice is very much around this sort of like grow a six-figure business, following some certain business strategies and business tactics that are not in any way bespoke to the business owner, to the business, to the particular circumstances of the business, and this sort of very generic advice that doesn't serve them.
I was going to say, now you're right up my point as well, because I see that generic business advice when we're looking at introverts and extroverts. The general model I see is one where people get given advice which might be great for extroverts. Just get out there and do this, that, and the other. But it's far too generic, and there's no way that an introvert is going to enjoy doing that. It's not relevant. So I guess there's a big parallel in there as well.
Well, yeah, because I think that links, say, if you're talking about marketing, is that about how you might approach marketing as an extrovert as compared to an introvert. So I don't know whether this is a particular extrovert or introvert thing, but I would rather communicate by writing than I would by video. I'll kind of force myself to do video, but I'm not at all in my happy place doing it. Not because I can't do it, but because it's not a medium that I find enjoyable. And then if I look on social media and I see people doing things like reels and kind of mucking around and having, you could say, being silly, having fun, whatever way you want to look at it, is like, that's just not something that I could do. And but there's a lot of kind of like, pushing people to use tactics.
You must do this. This is the way to do it. Yeah.
There are so many different ways that you can go about building a business.
One quick question just before we move on, because we're getting just over time at the moment, but How well do you think leaders understand introversion?
It's really hard for me to say because somebody I know does a lot of writing and research around introversion and leadership. So I'm kind of very aware of the content that she creates. I would probably say, in general, not very well. It certainly wasn't anything I ever heard discussed when I was in a sort of like more CEO role.
What do you think the implication of that is?
It's not understanding people's working styles and not understanding people's different strengths and weaknesses. And it means you're not going to be able to adapt yourself to sort of like managing your team in an appropriate way.
And therefore, so we don't get the most from them as a result.
Yeah.
Okay. So just before we finish then, Denise, could I ask you for a tip for an introvert, perhaps to help them turn their business into a force for good?
My tip for an introvert would be focus on your customer and what it is that the problems and needs that your customer has and how you can help them.
And what would be different about that for an introvert or a non-introvert?
I would say the same thing to an extrovert as well, but I think that it particularly plays to an introvert's strength, because I think one of the superpowers that introverts have is their ability to listen and to be kind of very attentive and to be empathic. I think there's a real opportunity for introverts to really tune into their customers.
Great way of them using that superpower, isn't it?
Yeah.
To understand customers.
Yeah.
Okay. And how about a tip for a non-introvert to turn their business into a force for good?
I would say the same thing, be to really listen to your customers and what they want. In that instance, for somebody who's more extroverted, that kind of being quiet and sort of like taking the space to listen might be maybe a little bit harder. But that's where all the gold is.
Yeah, absolutely. Denise, I'm sure that some of the listeners will want to get back in touch with you. What's your website address?
My name, Denise Willier.
I'll put that on the sleeve notes so that people can just click on that.
There's a contact thing on my website.
Okay. It's been wonderful to talk. Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And now it's time for Introvert Myth of the Week. Those crazy stories that I hear and you hear that some people actually believe. Extroverts are better salespeople. It's a myth. It's wrong. If we think of the stereotypical salesperson, they are extroverted, bubbly, and lots of other things that we could use. That doesn't mean extroverts are better, just that the stereotype is extrovert. There's a very old saying about selling: 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. That makes it sound like introverts might be better. Better at active listening, better at asking the right questions, and better at focusing on the client's needs. So if you're thinking about introverts or extroverts as salespeople, don't necessarily go with this myth. Back in Series 1, I interviewed Ben Kench, author of Selling for Dummies. You can listen to the interview at activateyourintrovert.co.uk. I asked him this very question. Ben said some of the best salespeople he knows are introverts. The good thing for introverts is that as a salesperson, it's not about you. It's about your customers, their needs, understanding their needs, serving them, and providing a solution that can solve their needs. I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.